Hello, I'm Devesh Narayanan. I'm a master's student in philosophy at the National University of Singapore, and my paper is called Welfarist Moral Grounding for Transparent AI. So let me begin by saying a bit about what exactly this project of moral grounding entails. As we know, transparency is one of the most widely endorsed principles for ethical AI. Most policy conversations feature in some form a demand that one ought to obtain clear and factual information about how an AI system comes to its decisions. But this agreement at the level of principles masks confusion about why exactly transparency matters morally. How should we think in a clear and systematic way about the basic moral considerations that animate calls for transparency? So there's lots that's already been said about this, right? There are various quite detailed proposals about moral goods like contestability or trust that transparency is supposed to help us secure. And that's all well and good. But one might still ask, right, why do these goods matter morally? What happens when they come into conflict with one another? And at a more basic level, what exactly is the normative connection between transparency and the pursuit of these various goods? At the same time, there have also been quite sophisticated critiques of the principle, right? The fact that transparency needs to be traded off against other desirable goods, or that transparency enables people to game the system to gain undeserved rewards, and so on. And so we should ask, how do we defend the principle against such critiques? And are there aspects of these critiques that we could use to sharpen our understanding of how and why to pursue transparency? These are the kinds of considerations that an attempt at moral grounding would hold front and center. In other words, the idea is to try and account in a systematic way for the various considerations that compete for our attention when we're trying to think clearly about what we ought to do. And the big picture idea of this paper is that welfarism or welfare consequentialism provides a theoretical basis for doing so. So what's welfarism? In the paper, I go into a bit more detail, but for now it's sufficient to treat welfarism as a family of views that hold these two commitments. First, that welfare is the only property of a state of affairs that has intrinsic moral value, and second, the goodness of a state of affairs scales according to the amount of welfare it contains. This means that welfarism is a consequentialist view. We assess the moral worthiness of an action based exclusively on the state of affairs created as a consequence of that action. Welfare itself can be conceptualized in a bunch of different ways. Again, I'll say a bit more about this in the paper, but for now I hope this account is specific enough to get the argument going, but also general enough to reach in an appeal to people who hold a bunch of different moral views that are broadly welfarist in persuasion. So with that in mind, what is the welfarist view on transparency? Quite simply, welfarists think that it is desirable to make AI systems transparent insofar as pursuing transparency tends to increase overall welfare, or maintaining opacity tends to reduce overall welfare. This might seem simple, maybe simplistic, and really the main argumentative move of the paper is to show that it has quite a bit of explanatory value. The way I go about doing this is by taking a bunch of things said on both sides of the transparency debate and recasting them in welfarist terms. So for arguments for transparency, I look at scrutiny, contestability, accountability, and trust. And for arguments against transparency, I look at trade-offs, double standards, and worries about gaming the system. And in each case, I try and pick out the secondary goods that transparency is supposed to be instrumental towards and ask, first, how do these goods relate to overall welfare? Second, how does transparency help or hinder the welfare benefits of these goods? And finally, what else is needed besides transparency to secure the welfare benefits of these goods? In making such moves, I try to show that a lot of existing confusions and ambiguities about the moral desirability of transparency can be clarified by tracing the effect of transparency on overall welfare. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time in this presentation to walk you through the arguments for each of these factors, but if the structure of the argument sounds interesting to you, please check out the paper. The entire middle section is basically devoted to this. But just to give you an illustration, let's look at one example. Let's talk about transparency, trust, and welfare. Transparency is believed to provide an epistemic warrant for trust. Here the idea is that if you know how a system works, you know on what grounds you should trust it. Now welfarists will look at this proposed connection and ask, how does trust and adoption, which is what trust is instrumental towards, relate to overall welfare? So of course, not all systems deserve to be trusted. Right? On the one hand, welfarists would encourage trust and adoption in AI systems that reliably help us achieve ends that are beneficial to overall welfare. Suppose you had an AI system that helps a city with great accuracy predict the onset of natural disasters. To take one imagined example, that's the kind of system where trust actively promotes the pursuit of socially beneficial causes, and welfarists would support trust on those grounds. At the same time, um, when systems are deployed towards harmful ends, mistrust and resistance can actually help alleviate some of these harms, and welfarists would endorse mistrust on those grounds. In turn, for the welfarist, the moral desirability of a system's transparency is contingent on the end served by that system. Right? Suppose you had a system that was used to police some minoritized community, for example, right? The mere fact that it was made transparent should not give us a moral reason to trust it. Right? And welfarism captures this kind of intuition. In so doing, it helps us avoid a problematic tendency to reify trust and adoption as an end in itself, as things to be perceived no matter what, because of course only socially beneficial systems deserve to be trusted. Again, that was just to give you a general taste of the types of arguments I'll be making in quite a bit more detail in the actual paper. In the time I have left in this presentation, I'd like to stay at a higher level of abstraction and talk more generally about what we gain from welfarist moral grounding. That's an advantage, right? Welfarism helps us avoid a tendency in current discussions to focus exclusively on one or a few desiderata, like contestability or accountability, or one or a few groups of stakeholders, like decision subjects and their right to contest decisions. Um, Now, such accounts can get us pretty far, right? But there's some considerations that they could miss. Here's a quick example. Suppose you had an AI system that was being used to pick one among a few candidates for the CEO position of a company. Now, the decision subjects who get to contest the decision are, of course, that small group of prospective CEOs, right? But the people who are most affected by the decision, arguably, are workers and the broader community that the organization serves. Now, if you were to focus on the welfare effects of the decision, you would have to extend moral consideration to a broader group of stakeholders. But if you were focusing exclusively on the right of a decision subject to contest a decision, you might not. The general idea is this, right? Um, Calls for transparency are animated by a rich and diverse set of moral reasons. And because there are no strict constraints in terms of what can or cannot be analyzed in terms of welfare effects, welfarism is generally pretty good at handling this diversity of reasons, and I think that's a nice feature of the view. Here's another important idea. We want to make sure that attempts to ground the principle capture cases where the mere provision of information is not enough. Think of, for instance, cases where transparency is not understandable or accessible to people who actually need the information, or cases where people just don't have the power to use the information to actually contest decisions or otherwise pursue socially beneficial ends. Now, because welfarists are explicitly concerned with securing the downstream welfare benefits of transparency, we cannot avoid thinking about questions of political economy, power, legal support, and other broader institutional factors that are needed for people to access and meaningfully act on information to produce desirable consequences. Again, I think this is a nice feature of the view. One last and perhaps minor thing. An important personal motivation for me to write this paper has been to draw in people who hold broadly welfarist views but aren't so interested in modern transparency debates. And here I'm thinking of the so-called long-termists. Long-termists worry about the hypothesized future effects of so-called super-intelligent AI systems, right? But even if these concerns come out of welfarism, they cannot possibly be the only thing that welfarists care about. As I hope to show, welfarist perspectives can add quite a bit of value to contemporary AI ethics debates. But to do this, we need to engage deeply and systematically with scholars and activists who are actively fighting and studying the contemporary effects of actually existing AI systems. In other words, for welfarism to provide moral grounding, we should ourselves remain grounded. And I hope that my account moves us in this direction. That's unfortunately all I have time for. There are some important limitations of the view which I discussed in the paper, but for now I'd like to close with this general idea. Transparency is a broader moral and political ideal about how we should relate to people and technologies that make decisions about us. Right? And as we try to get clearer about the moral considerations that underlie transparency, this should be the big picture view we're heading towards. I hope that my account helps a little bit in this way, but I'm sure much more needs to be said, and I'm excited about continuing these conversations. Thank you so much for your time.